June 1815. The lowlands of Belgium lie drowned beneath a relentless rain. Grey clouds hang like sodden curtains over the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean, where a single horseman moves through the mist, his cloak heavy with water, his face unreadable. Beneath him, the horse breathes clouds of steam into the cold dawn air. The sound of hooves is muffled by mud. In that half-light before the storm, there is only stillness, the kind that comes before history decides its course. The man is Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. Around him, an army of British, Dutch, and German troops struggles to wake under canvas soaked through by the night's downpour. Muskets must be dried, powder protected. Breakfasts of biscuit and rum are taken in silence. Wellington's eyes sweep the horizon, the rising ground, the shallow valley, the distant farms that will soon burn. He says little, for little needs to be said. The enemy is near. Napoleon has returned from exile, and Europe's fragile peace trembles once more. Waterloo was not meant to happen here. Only months earlier, the emperor had been a captive, his legend buried in the ashes of the empire. But France had followed him again, and now, with terrifying speed, the armies of Britain and Prussia were forced to gather on fields not yet dry from spring. For Wellington, it is not the grandeur of battle that fills his mind, but its terrible arithmetic, the ground he must hold, the men he will lose, and the narrow margin between triumph and ruin. He rides to the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte, inspecting its walls, its orchard, its line of sight toward the valley below. To others, it is a mere farm. To him, it is a fortress, a hinge upon which the fate of nations will soon turn. His officers follow at a respectful distance, knowing when not to speak. Wellington's command is built on silence, on the quiet authority of a man who has seen too much and trusts only what discipline can endure. The rain does not stop. It turns the roads to rivers, the gunpowder wagons to anchors in the mud. Soldiers curse and strain. Carts break their wheels, and still the Duke remains calm, almost detached. Those who serve under him often mistake this restraint for coldness, but it is the opposite. It is a discipline born from empathy, from understanding what panic can do to men. He once said, "The whole art of war consists in guessing what is on the other side of the hill. This morning, that hill hides Napoleon, and the guessing is almost over." Years of campaigning have shaped Wellington into something more than a general. In India, he learned the patience of logistics, the weight of command. In Spain, he learned how to hold ground when others could not. He is not a gambler like Napoleon, nor a visionary. He is, in the truest British sense, a craftsman of defense, of endurance, of order amid chaos. To him, battle is not glory but necessity, and victory is measured not in laurels, but in what survives the storm. As dawn lifts, the land reveals itself, the narrow ridge of Mont Saint-Jean, with its hedges and folds. The small farms of Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte anchoring either flank, and the open valley where Napoleon will come. The fields glisten with rainwater. They look harmless, almost pastoral. Soon they will be unrecognizable. The Duke studies them with the eye of an engineer and the heart of a realist. He knows these fields will be a graveyard before nightfall. Behind him, aides bring reports. The Prussians are still marching, the French cavalry massing. The Duke listens, nods once and gives no hint of doubt. He cannot afford it. Leadership, for him, is a performance of certainty. He feels the weight of every life under his command, but he carries it behind the mask of composure. Later, men will call him the Iron Duke. Yet iron, when struck, bends before it breaks. And Wellington knows how close a commander can come to breaking without showing it. As morning advances, he rides among the ranks, infantry from the shires, riflemen from the 95th, Scots in worn tartan, veterans of Spain, who know the sound of French guns. They stand quietly as he passes, some with awe, others with fear. His presence steadies them. He rarely smiles, rarely speaks more than a word of approval. But in that brief moment, the men believe he sees them, and that is enough. To them, Wellington's calm is not aloofness. It is faith embodied. The camera of history widens now. Beyond this ridge, beyond the lines of tents and cannons, lies all of Europe in suspense. Kings and ministers, bankers and peasants, all await the outcome of this field. For if Napoleon triumphs again, the old order shatters. If Wellington holds, a century of British dominion may begin. And yet, in this grey morning, the Duke thinks not of empires, but of earth, the firmness of the ridge beneath his boots, the line of sight for artillery, the timing of reserves. It is in the small, practical things that great destinies are decided. By noon, the rain begins to ease. A faint glimmer of light breaks through the clouds, falling across the sodden field where men are already forming ranks. Flags hang limp, drums are silent. In the stillness, one can almost hear the collective breath of an army waiting for fate to move. Wellington turns his horse once more toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond those woods, Napoleon prepares to strike. The Duke tightens his reins. There is no anger in him, no fear, only resolve. For all his victories, he has never faced this man in open battle. Napoleon, the architect of modern war. Wellington, the master of restraint. Two minds that have shaped a generation of soldiers, now drawn toward their final reckoning. The rain-drenched silence of Mont Saint-Jean will soon give way to thunder. But at this moment, the British commander sits motionless, as if time itself is holding its breath. When the guns finally speak, Europe will change forever. He was not born a hero. Arthur Wellesley entered the world in Dublin in 1769, the same year as Napoleon Bonaparte. A curious symmetry of fate. His family, Anglo-Irish aristocrats of fading means, lived between respectability and debt. The boy was shy, withdrawn, and as his mother once lamented, food for powder and nothing more. Few believed this quiet child would ever shape the fate of nations. Yet history often hides its architects in unlikely beginnings. Ireland in the late 18th century was a land of contrasts, grandeur and poverty, loyalty and rebellion. The young Arthur saw both. He was educated at Eton, but found little glory there. His tutors noted neither brilliance nor ambition. Only in the disciplined routine of the army did he begin to find purpose. Commissioned as an ensign at 18, his career began not with brilliance, but persistence. A devotion to competence that would one day distinguish him from men of genius undone by impulse. In his 20s, he sailed east to India, that vast, feverish crucible of empire. The voyage itself was a rite of passage. Months at sea, the endless monotony of wind and wave, the awareness that many would never return. When he arrived at Calcutta in 1797, the British Empire was not yet the confident colossus it would become. It was an experiment, fragile, improvised, driven by trade and ambition. The East India Company governed through alliances and intrigue, where every misstep could ignite rebellion or ruin. For a young officer, it was both an opportunity and ordeal. In India, Arthur Wellesley learned what no European classroom could teach: the brutal logistics of empire. The heat was unrelenting. Disease struck harder than musket fire. He studied supply lines, terrain, and the psychology of both ally and enemy. At night, under the dim light of oil lamps, he would read reports, plan movements, and measure every mile of ground before advancing. To him, war was not about glory, but about preparation. The Indian campaigns would turn this instinct into doctrine. By 1799, the British sought to break the power of Tipu Sultan of Mysore, a ruler as cunning as he was defiant. Wellesley, still only a colonel, was tasked with leading men through jungles and monsoons towards Seringapatam, Tipu's stronghold. The siege was long and merciless. When the walls finally fell, the city became a furnace of chaos, looting, fire, and death. Amidst it all, Wellesley imposed order with a severity that startled even his comrades. He understood that discipline was not cruelty. It was civilization's only defense against the madness of conquest. In the aftermath, he governed Seringapatam with a cool efficiency that caught the eye of his superiors. He rebuilt markets, restored justice, and ensured the soldiers' conduct was restrained. For Wellesley, victory was meaningless if it bred disorder. "We make war," he once wrote, "only to secure peace." It was a rare sentiment in an age of empire, one that set him apart from those who saw colonies as trophies rather than responsibilities. 2 years later, at Assaye, that principle would be tested to its limit. Facing the Maratha Confederacy, Wellesley commanded barely 9,000 men against an enemy nearly 8 times his number. The field was dry and dusty, the air thick with heat. His officers hesitated. The odds were appalling, yet Wellesley chose to attack, not out of recklessness, but precision. He had studied the river crossings, the artillery placements, the morale of the foe. When the battle came, it was savage. Cannonballs tore through lines. Smoke choked the sun. His horse was shut beneath him, and still he pressed forward, steady, methodical, never surrendering command. When it was over, the Marathas were broken. Wellesley's army, though battered, had achieved the impossible. It was his first great victory, but he would never romanticize it. "The hardest thing of all," he said afterward, "is to see the dead men lying about you, and not to think you could have done something to prevent it." That capacity for reflection, the refusal to hide behind triumph, would follow him all his life. India taught him 3 lessons that no European campaign could. First, that war is not a test of courage, but of endurance. Second, logistics win battles long before the first shot is fired. And third, that a commander must never fight for pride. Every decision, every movement, must serve a purpose greater than ambition. In the furnace of the subcontinent, Wellesley learned to balance ruthlessness with restraint, the 2 halves of mastery. By the time he returned to England in 1805, he was no longer merely Arthur Wellesley of Dublin. He was a man forged by empire, calm, methodical, and quietly ambitious. The newspapers barely noticed his arrival. Europe's attention was fixed on Napoleon's victories at Ulm and Austerlitz. Yet, in the corridors of the War Office, his name began to circulate as one of those rare officers who combined intellect with resolve. He had not the brilliance of Napoleon, but something subtler, an unshakable steadiness that could outlast storms. The transformation was complete. The uncertain boy from Dublin had become a soldier of precision, a man who had seen both the might and the misery of empire, and who would carry those lessons into the heart of Europe's final reckoning. The stage was now set for the Peninsular War, where Arthur Wellesley, soon to be the Duke of Wellington, would perfect the art of holding ground not just for Britain, but for the balance of the civilized world. And as he prepared to return to the continent, the reign of India faded behind him, replaced by the winds of Spain, a new Crucible, and the beginning of the legend. The winds of the empire had shifted. Across Europe, Napoleon's eagles flew from Lisbon to Warsaw, from the Alps to the Danube. Britain stood alone, her navy unchallenged at sea, but her army scattered, small and untested against the emperor's vast legions. It was in this perilous solitude that Arthur Wellesley was called once more to war. His destination, the Iberian Peninsula, a rugged land of vineyards and mountains, of farmers turned partisans, and of empires in decay. It would become the proving ground of his genius, and the forge of his legend. When Wellesley landed in Portugal in the summer of 1808, Europe had already begun to despair. Spain's old monarchy had fallen, replaced by Napoleon's brother Joseph. Portugal had been invaded, and the French armies moved with mechanical precision. Britain's intervention seemed, at first, a desperate gesture, a nation of merchants sending its soldiers to fight the greatest general alive. Yet Wellesley, fresh from his Indian campaigns, understood something that others did not. Wars are not won by grandeur, but by ground. By the patient mastery of terrain, logistics, and morale. The peninsula was unforgiving. Roads dissolved into mud. Supplies vanished into the hills. Every valley was a trap, every village a rumor. The locals fought with a ferocity born of desperation. Spanish guerrillas struck French convoys and melted back into the mountains, forcing Napoleon's veterans to fight an enemy they could not see. It was in this chaos that Wellesley began to impose order, not through spectacle, but through discipline. His army, though smaller, became a model of precision. Lines formed and reformed under fire. Supplies arrived where none should have, and soldiers began to believe that, under this quiet man, defeat was not inevitable. At Vimero, he delivered his first triumph on European soil. His men held firm against repeated French assaults, breaking the myth of invincibility that had cloaked Napoleon's marshals. But even victory was a fragile thing. Within days, political interference forced him to sign the Convention of Sintra, a humiliating agreement that allowed the defeated French to withdraw unpunished. Public outrage in Britain was fierce. Wellesley, though blameless, took the criticism in silence. He learned early that a commander must bear not only the weight of battle, but the burden of politics. That true courage is endurance under misunderstanding. By the following year, he returned to Portugal with greater authority and a clearer purpose. The campaign that followed was not a blaze of glory, but a slow, grinding resistance. Wellesley built fortifications, established depots, and above all studied the land as if it were a living ally. When he withdrew, it was never in panic but calculation. When he advanced, it was only when the ground, the weather, and the will of his men aligned. To observers, his caution seemed frustrating. To history, it became wisdom. The Peninsular War revealed the limits of Napoleon's empire. His armies could win battles but not peace. They could occupy cities, but not hearts. Wellesley saw it clearly. War was not a matter of brilliance, but of endurance. At Talavera, his army held firm through a night of fire, repelling wave after wave of French attacks. The losses were appalling. The fields were littered with British and Spanish dead, the heat stifling, the air thick with the stench of powder and blood. Yet through it all, Wellesley remained calm, visiting the wounded, writing reports, preparing for the next day as though emotion itself were a luxury. He did not boast, did not despair. He simply endured. By 1810, Napoleon sent one of his finest marshals, Masséna, to drive the British into the sea. Wellesley responded not with attack, but with architecture, the lines of Torres Vedras, a chain of fortifications stretching 30 miles north of Lisbon, invisible from afar, impregnable up close. For months, the French advanced, only to find themselves trapped in a barren wilderness, their supplies gone, their men starving. The British waited behind their walls, patient, silent, unyielding. When the French finally retreated, it was not from defeat in battle, but from exhaustion. Wellesley had learned the greatest truth of command. Sometimes, victory lies in doing nothing but holding your ground. Through the long years that followed, at Busaco, Salamanca, Vitoria, his method never changed. He used the landscape as his ally, his troops as instruments of precision, his temperament as a shield against despair. His soldiers trusted him absolutely. They saw in his composure not coldness but faith. When others raged, he calculated. When others doubted, he observed. It was said that Wellington fought battles as if conducting an orchestra. Every regiment, every ridge, every movement serving the harmony of control. And yet, beneath that control, there was humanity. He despised unnecessary cruelty. He ordered looters shot not out of severity, but to protect civilians from the savagery of undisciplined war. When his troops entered captured towns, he enforced restraint. For him, war was a necessary evil, a burden to be borne with honor, not indulged with vengeance. That restraint, rare in an age of conquest, earned him both respect and fear. The men called him Old Nosey behind his back, affection laced with awe. They knew he saw everything, forgot nothing, forgave little, and never abandoned them. By 1814, after 6 relentless years, the tide turned. Napoleon's armies, worn down by distance, resistance, and their own arrogance, crumbled before the Allied advance. From the mountains of Spain to the gates of Toulouse, the British banner moved steadily forward. When the Emperor finally fell, it was this long, grinding campaign, not the swift glory of Austerlitz or Jena, that proved decisive. It had shown Europe that patience could defeat brilliance, and that an empire of endurance could outlast one of ambition. In the quiet that followed, Wellesley returned to Britain a national hero. Yet there was no triumph in his eyes, only fatigue. He knew how many thousands had fallen for each ridge and village gained. He knew that courage was not found in charge or conquest, but in the act of holding fast, of refusing to yield when the world seemed lost. He had faced the best of Napoleon's marshals and never been defeated. But his greatest test was yet to come. For even as peace settled across Europe, far away on a Mediterranean island, a familiar figure stirred, and the thunder of the empire began to roll once more. As the guns of the Peninsula fell silent and Europe dared to breathe again, 2 men stood astride the age like opposing principles made flesh. One, in Paris, sat upon a throne forged by genius and ambition, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, the self-made titan who had bent kings to his will. The other, in London, walked with the bearing of restraint. Arthur Wellesley, newly titled the Duke of Wellington, a soldier who had mastered victory not by fire and fury, but by patience, precision, and the endurance of iron. They had never met, yet across the years their minds had been at war. Napoleon ruled by imagination. His was an empire of movement, of lightning thrusts and impossible speed. He believed that war, like destiny, favored the bold. His armies lived on the rhythm of attack, always pressing forward, always seeking the decisive blow. His maps were alive with arrows. His victories, symphonies of chaos conducted by one will. He had studied the Republic and devoured it, replacing liberty with glory. To his soldiers, he was more than mortal. He was France itself. Wellington, by contrast, distrusted movement for movement's sake. Where Napoleon was theater, he was geometry. To him, the battlefield was not a stage but an equation. Every ridge, every river, Every line of retreat had its place in a calm, ordered logic. He believed the art of war was not in the act of striking, but in the art of waiting, forcing the enemy to move first, to reveal his hand. Napoleon conquered through imagination, Wellington through discipline. One made history through fire, the other shaped it through control. The clash of these philosophies began long before their armies ever faced one another. From the Spanish plains to the northern passes, their campaigns formed an invisible dialogue, a conversation of maneuvers across maps and dispatches. At Salamanca, Wellington struck not from impulse, but from pattern, observing the rhythm of the French columns, waiting until the slightest overreach exposed their flank. Then, in a moment of terrifying precision, he unleashed his counterstroke. It was not brilliance. It was mastery. Napoleon's marshals, trained in his audacity but not his intellect, could not match it. The French line collapsed. After Salamanca, Europe began to whisper that perhaps the emperor was not invincible after all. In London, bells rang, and Parliament hailed Wellington as the savior of the Peninsula. But the Duke, ever measured, refused triumph. He knew that victory was never absolute, that every advance was bought in blood and could be lost by arrogance. He once remarked that the hardest thing of all is to know when to stop. Napoleon had never learned that lesson. Wellington lived by it. By 1813, their duel of ideas reached its crescendo at Vittoria, a battle not merely for Spain, but for the moral soul of war itself. Napoleon was far away, tied to his crumbling empire, but his system, his very way of fighting, stood before Wellington in the form of King Joseph's army. The French were stretched across too wide a front, their supply lines strangled, their discipline frayed. Wellington's response was textbook. No drama, no reckless charges. He orchestrated a series of converging assaults, striking where the enemy was weakest, cutting off escape before the French even realized they were defeated. When it ended, Napoleon's power in Spain was finished. His wagons, filled with looted treasure, were abandoned in the mud. His marshals fled. The emperor's shadow, once vast, had begun to shrink. Yet Wellington took no pleasure in humiliation. He saw in Napoleon's empire not only tyranny, but brilliance, a genius corrupted by his own certainty. The Duke admired order, and in Napoleon's France, he recognized its mirror image, order twisted into domination. Both men sought control, but where Napoleon ruled men's passions, Wellington ruled his own. In that difference lay the fate of Europe. The campaigns of 1813 and 1814 were a slow unraveling of the Napoleonic system. Wellington, ever cautious, pressed north through the Pyrenees, methodically driving the French back toward their borders. He refused to chase glory. He chased advantage. His supply lines were immaculate, his intelligence precise, his soldiers fed and clothed while Napoleon starved. When he finally crossed into France itself, he did so without fanfare, just a man doing his duty to the end. And while the Duke advanced with measured steps, Napoleon fought like a cornered lion. In the snows of Champagne, the emperor still produced miracles, defeating larger armies through audacity alone. But he was fighting not just the Allies, he was fighting the mathematics of exhaustion. His world had expanded too far, his victories cost too much. Wellington, far from the spectacle, simply kept closing the jaws. Where Napoleon sought to shock the world into submission, Wellington sought to steady it into survival. The two men's destinies converged, unseen, as Paris fell. When the emperor abdicated in 1814, Europe exhaled. Wellington entered the city not as a conqueror, but as a custodian of peace. His men marched quietly, their discipline as sharp in victory as in war. He dined with kings, negotiated with ministers, and watched as France, broken but unbowed, began its uneasy reconstruction. He had triumphed over Napoleon's system, yet he understood that genius cannot be destroyed, only displaced. And so, as the Duke returned to London, fated as the defender of Europe, he did not celebrate. He sensed what others could not, that a man like Napoleon does not vanish into history so easily. The emperor, he said once, is a man who will never rest while he breathes. And in the quiet halls of the British government, whispers already began to circulate, whispers that the exile on Elba was restless, that his mind still burned with unspent fire. The war of arms was over, but the war of spirits between ambition and restraint, between fire and will, was not. In the months to come, Europe would discover that even in defeat, the shadow of the emperor still loomed over every throne. And the man destined to stand against that shadow had already prepared all his life to do so. Spring returned to Europe with deceptive gentleness. The snows melted, the markets reopened, and in the salons of Brussels, music filled the air once more. For a brief, shimmering moment, the world believed peace had returned. Yet beneath the chandeliers and polite laughter, there was unease. That strange silence history keeps just before it breaks. For somewhere across the sea, a man once thought buried by history had risen again. Napoleon had escaped from Elba. He landed in France with barely 1,000 men. Within days, he had an army. Peasants, veterans, officers who had once sworn allegiance to the Bourbons, all turned back to the only leader they had ever believed in. As he marched north toward Paris, the countryside erupted in feverish loyalty. "The eagle flies," his followers whispered, and the cry swept like wildfire through the villages and valleys of France. By the time he reached the capital, the army meant to stop him had joined him instead. The emperor was once more upon his throne. When the news reached London, disbelief turned to alarm. Across Europe, kings trembled. But in Brussels, Arthur Wellesley, now the Duke of Wellington, received the message with the calm of a man who had expected it all along. He understood Napoleon's nature too well to think him finished. In the gilded ballrooms of the Belgian capital, he now commanded a fragile coalition. Dutch and Belgian levies, Hanoverian regiments, and his own British veterans, hardened in the Spanish sun, but weary from years of war. They were brave, but they were not ready. Brussels in 1815 was a city suspended between peace and panic. Officers danced, politicians schemed, merchants speculated. Every street was alive with rumors. Some said Napoleon's armies were already at the border. Others claimed he had been defeated by the Prussians. Yet, through it all, Wellington moved like a figure carved in stone, courteous, unhurried, perfectly composed. He attended dinners, reviewed troops, and studied maps deep into the night. To his staff, his composure seemed almost unnatural. But those who knew him best understood. This was his armor. Beneath it, the weight of destiny pressed like lead. At the Duchess of Richmond's ball, the eve of war played out as theatre. The candles glowed, the violins sang, and the ladies, dressed in silk and diamonds, twirled beside men who would be dead within 48 hours. Wellington himself danced, unflinching, the model of civility. Yet between the steps, aides whispered intelligence reports. The French had crossed the frontier. Napoleon was advancing. Still, the Duke smiled, bowed, and continued to dance. It was not arrogance. It was discipline. Panic spreads from the top, and he would not allow it to begin with him. When he finally left the ballroom in the small hours, the music fading behind him, the illusion of peace collapsed. He mounted his horse and rode into the darkness, the city already stirring with the clatter of drums and orders. The campaign had begun. His army, scattered across miles of countryside, would have to assemble in haste. Every road, every hour mattered. Yet the Duke betrayed no urgency. "We shall not be the first to move," he had told his staff earlier. "But we shall be the last to retreat." It was the essence of his command: patience, control, timing. In the following days, as the Allied forces converged, the scale of the challenge became clear. Napoleon's army was not the grand host of Austerlitz or Jena, but it was still formidable, veterans of 1,000 battles, united by devotion, and led by a man whose very presence transformed fear into fury. Wellington's troops were a patchwork of nations and languages, their loyalty untested. He faced not only the enemy across the field, but the chaos within his own ranks. It was a kind of warfare no textbook could teach, the management of uncertainty itself. Through it all, his calm never broke. Witnesses recalled his quietness, the way he stood alone for hours over maps, or rode in silence through camp lines, his eyes missing nothing. To the young officers around him, this composure was both unnerving and magnetic. They could not tell whether he felt nothing or everything. In truth, Wellington's control was an act of will, a lifetime of mastering the terror that comes with command. He once confessed that every battle was a scene he dreaded. "There is nothing," he wrote, "so dreadful as a battle won, except a battle lost." He knew what it meant to lead men into the storm, and to carry their ghosts afterward. As the Allied army moved toward the Belgian frontier, the landscape shifted from spring's brightness to the somber green of approaching rain. Villages emptied, roads clogged with wagons and refugees. The air grew heavy, thunder building somewhere beyond the horizon. And there, In that charged stillness before the clash, Wellington's demeanor hardened into purpose. He rode through his lines, inspecting guns, speaking briefly with commanders, reassuring them in the simplest words. "Stand firm," he would say. "Rely on one another." It was not poetry, but in his mouth it became law. Beyond the horizon, Napoleon moved with his old genius, dividing his enemies, striking before they could unite. At Ligny, he crushed the Prussians under Blücher. At Quatre Bras, Wellington fought to hold his ground. The fields ran red, the air thick with smoke and rain. Yet even as the front buckled, the Duke refused to break. When others urged retreat, he held firm, buying the hours the Prussians needed to recover. His genius was not in inspiration, but endurance, the power to absorb chaos and still think clearly. By the night of June the 17th, as rain lashed the countryside and cannon fire flickered in the distance, the Duke withdrew his army to a ridge south of Brussels, Mont Saint-Jean. He chose it instinctively, as if the land itself whispered its secret strength. There he would wait. There, the final reckoning would come. In Brussels, the ballroom stood empty now, their candles extinguished, their mirrors reflecting only silence. The music had stopped. Europe was awake again, staring into the face of its fate. And somewhere beyond the storm, Napoleon rode north through the darkness, his empire's last hope gleaming in his eyes. Wellington tightened his cloak against the rain and looked toward the horizon. He knew the morning would bring thunder. The time for patience was ending. The time for history had come. Dawn broke over the fields of Belgium, grey and wet, the air heavy with the scent of rain and powder. The ridge of Mont Saint-Jean lay quiet for the last time. A low rise of farmland turned into a fortress. Across the valley, through drifting mist, the French army waited. Veterans in worn blue coats, their banners streaked with mud and memory. Napoleon himself stood among them, his greatcoat drawn tight, his eyes fixed on the British line. 2 men, 2 empires, 2 worlds, now divided by barely a mile of ground. The night before, Wellington had slept little. Rain hammered the roof of his headquarters at Waterloo village. Dispatches arrived by the hour. The Prussians were marching to join him, but slowly. Napoleon was closer, faster, and stronger. In that flickering candlelight, the Duke studied his maps, tracing the contour of the ridge, the folds of ground where his infantry would stand. He was not planning brilliance. He was planning survival. His army was tired, patchwork, understrength, British regulars mixed with Dutch and German allies. Yet his belief never wavered. If he could hold until the Prussians came, Europe would be saved. When morning came, the fields were a swamp. Boots sank into the soil. Cannon stood mired like stranded beasts. The battle began late, Napoleon waiting for the ground to dry. Then, around 11, the French guns opened, a rolling thunder that shook the earth. The ridge erupted in smoke and flame. Wellington's men crouched behind hedges and sunken roads, muskets ready. He rode along the line, his calm presence cutting through fear. "Stand steady," he called. "Steady, my lads." His voice was measured, almost conversational, the tone of a man giving instructions for parade, not apocalypse. At Hougoumont, on his right flank, the fight began in earnest. A walled farmhouse surrounded by orchards and hedgerows, it became the hinge of his defense. The French came in waves, shouting "Vive l'Empereur!" as musket fire tore through the trees. British guardsmen held the gates with bayonets and sheer resolve. The flames climbed the walls. Men fought in smoke so thick they could barely breathe. Through the din, Wellington watched from the ridge. He refused to reinforce it too heavily, knowing Hougoumont was not to be won, only to be held. Its defense was a lesson in his philosophy. Victory through endurance, not advance. By afternoon, Napoleon shifted his attack to the center. The ground shook beneath the advance of cuirassiers and dragoons, thousands of horsemen glinting through the haze. They charged uphill, lances lowered, sabers drawn into the iron discipline of British infantry squares. 4 ranks deep, bayonets out, their flags fluttering defiantly. The redcoats stood like walls of flesh and steel. The French cavalry swept around them, crashing against their sides again and again, but the squares did not break. Within them, men reloaded, fired, and waited, the calm rhythm of survival. When the horses fell, they stepped over the dead and closed ranks again. High on the ridge, Wellington watched it all, the slow turning of chaos into endurance. Cannonballs tore the ground near him. Aides fell at his side. Yet he remained upright, his telescope in hand, issuing orders in an even voice. His calm became contagious. To his men, his composure was their lifeline, proof that the world still had order amidst the storm. "Hard pounding, gentlemen," he muttered under his breath. "But we shall see who can pound the longest." The hours dragged on. Smoke thickened until the sky turned yellow. The French infantry surged forward once more, only to be repelled. Behind them, the Emperor watched, his genius clouded by fatigue and illness. He had gambled that Wellington's center would collapse before the Prussians arrived. But on the eastern horizon, black dots began to move, the first columns of Blucher's army. The Duke, learning of their approach, held his line even tighter. He could not win alone, but he could deny Napoleon victory. And that was enough. As evening fell, the Emperor made his final play. The Imperial Guard, his last reserve, the veterans who had never known defeat. They advanced up the slope in perfect silence, their bearskin caps and blue coats dark against the smoke. "La garde avance!" cried the French officers. "Vive l'Empereur!" Wellington's artillery opened fire at close range. The guard wavered, then surged forward again. British and Allied troops, exhausted and blood-soaked, closed ranks once more. On the ridge, Wellington rode forward, raised his hat and called out, "Now, Maitland! Now's your time!" The British Guards rose from behind the ridge and fired volley after volley into the advancing column. The air turned white with smoke. The Imperial Guard faltered, hesitated, and for the first time in its history, began to fall back. Word spread like wildfire through the French line. La garde recule. The guard retreats. What had been thunder became collapse. Across the valley, the French army broke. Wellington sat motionless for a moment, as if disbelieving it himself. Then, turning to his staff, he said quietly, "Night or the Prussians must come." Moments later, Blucher's troops arrived, sweeping the field. The last light of day fell upon a landscape unrecognizable. Farms shattered, fields churned to mud, tens of thousands dead or dying. He did not exult. He did not shout. When the battle was done, Wellington rode among the fallen in silence. "Nothing," he said later, "except a battle lost can be half so melancholy as a battle won." He had saved Europe, but the cost defied comprehension. Around him, soldiers wept, searching for friends in the dusk. The Duke dismounted and walked alone for a while, the weight of command pressing harder than ever before. That night, as the guns fell silent and rain began again to fall over Waterloo, a legend was born, not of brilliance, but of endurance. In that sodden Belgian field, Wellington's patience, precision, and iron will had defeated the greatest soldier of the modern age. Napoleon's empire lay shattered, and Britain's place in the world was sealed. But the Duke felt no triumph, only exhaustion. He had held the line when all seemed lost. And in doing so, he had proven that victory, in the end, belongs not to the boldest, but to the last who endures. The guns fell silent, but for Wellington, the echoes of Waterloo never stopped. The fields of Belgium receded into memory, and yet they followed him home like ghosts, the faces of the men he had lost, the sounds of their last cries carried into his sleep. When he returned to Britain, it was as a national hero, the conqueror of Napoleon, the man who had saved Europe. Bells rang, crowds cheered, poets sang his name. Yet behind the applause, he felt only a deep, unshakable quiet. Britain itself had changed. The country he returned to was not the same one he had left for Spain years before. The war had transformed its people, proud, weary, and uncertain of the peace they had purchased. In London, Parliament debated reform. Industry churned in smoky towns, and a new generation began to question the old order of kings and aristocrats. Amid that shifting world, Wellington found himself both revered and misunderstood. A symbol of discipline in an age of ambition, of stoicism in a nation yearning to move. He took no joy in power, yet power sought him nonetheless. The Duke entered politics almost reluctantly, serving first as commander-in-chief, then as prime minister. In Parliament, he spoke as he had fought, with precision, restraint, and an unbending sense of duty. But war and government are different kinds of battles. The battlefield had offered clarity, one enemy, one purpose. In Westminster, he found only compromise and noise. His bluntness, his refusal to flatter, made him admired by some and despised by others. "The Duke knows nothing of politics," one rival sneered. He only knows how to win. But even in politics, Wellington's victory was endurance. As Prime Minister, he faced Britain's own storms. The demands for Catholic emancipation, for political reform, for recognition of a changing world. Many saw him as a reactionary, a soldier clinging to the past. Yet when the moment of crisis came, he did what few of his class dared. He changed his mind. In 1829, despite fierce opposition from his own allies, he championed the Catholic Relief Act, granting rights to millions long denied. Conscience, he said simply, is not a matter of party. It was an act of courage quieter than Waterloo, but no less significant. He had once saved Britain from invasion. Now, in a sense, he saved it from itself. Still, peace never sat comfortably on his shoulders. The Duke's life had been built on command, on purpose. Now, with no battle left to fight, he became a figure of paradox, both the strongest and loneliest man in England. He lived simply, kept to routine, and refused to glorify his own deeds. When admirers spoke of him as the Iron Duke, he smiled thinly. He knew iron rusts. He carried the memory of his men, the ones who had held the ridge, who had died believing he would bring them home. Next to a battle lost, he had said, the greatest misery is a battle gained. It was not rhetoric. It was truth. In old age, he became something larger than himself, an emblem of the nation's character. Visitors came from across Europe to see him, princes, poets, young officers seeking wisdom. They found a man courteous, measured, and spare in words. He spoke rarely of Waterloo, and when he did, it was without flourish. They were fine fellows, he would say softly of his soldiers. They did their duty. In those few words lay the entire creed of his life. When he died in 1852, Britain mourned as it had not mourned since Nelson. The procession through London stretched for miles, soldiers, statesmen, commoners walking together beneath a grey November sky. His coffin, draped in the Union flag, passed beneath silent crowds. There were no triumphal shouts, no celebration, only reverence. In that silence, the nation recognized what Wellington had truly represented. Not glory, but steadiness. Not conquest, but conscience. He had lived through an age of upheaval and emerged unchanged in essence. He was the soldier who became Britain, the embodiment of its endurance, its restraint, its quiet moral force. To the young Victoria, who attended his funeral in mourning black, he had been the last of the giants, a link to an older world of certainty and command. To the ordinary Briton, he was proof that greatness could exist without grandeur. In the years that followed, his name became legend. Painters captured his calm at Waterloo. Historians debated his genius. But perhaps his greatest legacy was not in the battles he fought, nor the empire he defended, but the example he left behind, of leadership without vanity, of strength without cruelty, of duty without complaint. Wellington once said, "Habit is 10 times nature." It was his philosophy, his defense against chaos. Yet beyond habit, beyond iron discipline, lay something more, a faith in endurance itself. He had learned, through war and peace alike, that the measure of a man and of a nation is not how it conquers, but how it stands. And so, in the quiet halls of Westminster Abbey, where his tomb rests beside kings and poets, one can still sense the echo of that steadfast spirit, the calm at the heart of the storm, the silence before the thunder. The Duke who never lost to Napoleon, because he never lost himself.